All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's May Advisor webinar for Delta Upsilon. Our topic for today is on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Michelle Marchand. I'm the Senior Director of Chapter Development for Delta Upsilon. And so pleased that you could join us. And for those of you that I know will be watching this recording afterwards, I'm glad that you're watching the recording. So very excited about our presenter today. I'm going to give you an introduction to Cicely before I turn it over to her. So Cicely Hunter is the Assistant Director of Equity and Inclusion at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Some of you may recognize that that is home to our Carthage DU chapter. Cicely received her Bachelor of Arts degree at Marquette University, where she majored in history and political science and minored in Africana studies. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of American Studies at St. Louis University, where she also received her master's degree. Her teaching and research are at the intersection of race, class, and gender, as she builds upon existing scholarship about the Black diaspora. In particular, she examines American history with an emphasis with an emphasis on Black social movements, visual culture, and urban studies during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Cicely has extensive experience as an educator and as a contributor to nonprofit organizations. She's certified as a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, IDI, and she consults, advises, and addresses bias incident reports in a timely manner. Her strong academic background in American studies and our racial history impacts Carthage's anti-racism education efforts. She is passionate about serving historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups as an equity warrior. She designs and facilitates signature programs, History Month programs, racism, LGBTQIA, and diverse ability trainings. We are so grateful to have Cicely with us today. The goal of this webinar is really to provide our DU advisors and volunteers with a perspective on what is happening on college campuses today around the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we couldn't be more grateful and thankful to Cicely for joining us. So I am going to mute myself and turn it over to you, Cicely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks everybody for having me in this space. It really is a privilege to be here and share space with you all today. So I will go ahead and kick things off. So I am Cicely Hunter. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm here to share some remarks about my experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion professionally, right? And so we have to kick things off with an outline just to ground our conversation today. So I will share a little bit about myself. So thank you so much for that overview. Very comprehensive. I probably shouldn't even give this overview, but just to give you a sense of some of the things I'm working on right now. Then I will go on to name a few terms, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion, also known as DEI. So if I refer to it as DEI, it's just the acronym. Then we will consider a diversity iceberg, and then we will follow up with this acronym that I've kind of led the charge of specifically honing in on the work that I do. So this is really a professional and a personal way in which I attack the work currently. And then we will have a quick conversation about personal wellness, followed by a Q&A. All right. So I am Cicely Hunter. I'm currently, of course, working as the Assistant Director of Equity and Inclusion at Carthage, and I've been serving in this particular role since August of 2020. And I'm quickly approaching that 1-year mark. And so I'm also a doctoral candidate working on my dissertation. So right now I'm examining Black parades in the 1910s and 20s, specifically in New York, and thinking about Black representation and identity formation, specifically in the streets, right, and how they're executing that. In my current role, I am tasked with working directly with students. So this includes cultural organizations ranging from all different affinity groups, and I host programming around History Months, Heritage Months as well. And I also started a couple of different initiatives to support students of color. And so one of those initiatives was Sister to Sister, and the other one is Black at Carthage for all Black students. And I've also created space for students to build community across organizations. So this specific entity is called CORE. So this is Cultural Organization Resource Empowerment. And we usually meet once a month. So my supervisor and I have also led the charge on honoring 75 years of Black excellence. And so specifically equity and inclusion was tasked initially with this effort. This is now more of an institutional commitment now. So we have support all over campus. And we've also made history. So we created the first ever Black graduate ceremony as well as first generation graduate ceremony. And so we made history, you all. So we were really, really, really proud of this initiative that came forth. And right now, I'm here with you all today, specifically as a diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker. And so in addition to this training, I also facilitate trainings around history of racism in the United States and also anti-Blackness, racial violence, and social movements. All right. And so we are going to spend between like the next 20 to 25 minutes talking specifically about the work that I've done and some of the challenges and changes that have happened and that I've encountered over these past several months. And so I'm here today really to kind of set the foundation for some of the trainings that you all will have. So this is not necessarily going to be a conversation on what is racism, what is unconscious and conscious bias. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty of that sort of work, but you all will probably be doing some of that in the future. But this is more so just to equip you and give you a sense of what is the work that I'm currently doing and in the role that I'm in, and just to give you a perspective of what's kind of going on in the community at Carthage, right? And then also kind of considering some ways in which some other directors, assistant directors, or officers as well are doing this work, some of the things that they may have encountered as well. All right, so now we're going to dive into talking specifically about the terminology, just so that we all have a basis for this conversation for today. So diversity is the practice or the quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds. And this may be gender-based, sexual orientation, race, right? Whatever affinity group, right? So that's diversity. So we can really think about diversity in the way of specifically having representation, people at the table, okay? And then we can think about equity as the quality of being fair and impartial, or the pledge of fair treatment. This is the opportunity and advancement while striving to identify and eliminate those barriers. So what this work might look like is finding specific failures in the system across different levels, right? And so that we have greater fair opportunities and treatment, and we're actually working to eliminate some of those barriers that exist. Now we'll talk about inclusion. So this is the act or the state of being included or being included, contained as a part of a whole within a group or a structure. And so it's the act of bringing together and harnessing difference in a way that's beneficial to society, right? And so we can bring people into the fold regardless of their differences, and allowing those differences to cultivate a rich environment that is diverse in providing different perspectives. And we're using these differences as a strength rather than considering them to be a weakness, right? And so these are the terms in which guide the work in which I am doing. And so what I want to make mention here is that there's a desire sometimes to have diversity, but sometimes there's not a real true commitment to creating equity and inclusion. So I'm not just specifically talking about Carthage, but I'm just saying across campuses, right? All across the country, because we know that there has been an expansion of this particular realm. So it's not necessarily enough to have diverse, right, groups present, but we really have to begin to pinpoint some of the specific practices, some of the specific policies or procedures that are in place that continue to perpetuate this marginalization and disenfranchising various groups, right? So that we can truly incorporate that change that is necessary and needed in those communities. And so we have to be intentional about the work that we're doing. And sometimes there's this tendency, right, to kind of slap a Band-Aid over it, smooth things over, move on to the next thing, but we're really not truly integrating and incorporating those lasting changes. And that's what's at the root of what we really need to do with this work. And so I'm going to share with you all this little diagram here, just to kind of give you an idea of the ways in which this work is really overlapping. And that piece where it overlaps is the sense of creating an environment of belonging, right? Making sure that whatever it is, that they're fully immersed into the culture and into the community that they belong in. And so I oftentimes ask students, so these are some of the questions that I personally ask them. So I have them, take time to reflect. Just, we don't have to do this together. Just, I want you to like think about these things, right? This is how I approach it. And I'll ask them the following questions. Do you feel fully immersed into the culture of X institution? So we could say Carthage. Some of the other schools I've been to, St. Louis University, Marquette. Do you feel fully immersed into that culture? Do you feel like when you leave that specific campus, that a piece of you, right, will be left as a legacy, right? So that even after you leave, that you're leaving something behind. Do you feel like that? And if you don't, maybe who do we need to make sure that we reach out to get you to that point where you're contributing to that specific community? And what is missing in your own personal experience? So I asked them this too. So it's important, of course, that they're hitting all the markers when it comes to the classroom. That's a given, right? That there's no disputing that. But we also need to make sure that beyond the classroom, that they are having those engagement pieces, that they really feel like they are establishing their sense of belonging at that particular campus. And that is at the center of the work that I do. I think it's really important. So I love, seeing them excel in the classroom. It's amazing. It's phenomenal. But also I want to see them be successful even outside of the classroom as well. And so we have to be aware of the ways in which people come to campus, right? So not everybody has the same experience, right? That's a given as well. Like we know that. Because of age, because of race, because of nationality, because of their upbringing, their class, their sexual orientation, their religion. We can, name all the differences which exist. And so we really have to be intentional about the ways that we interact with our students. And so this is why it's so important to think about our interactions with our students. And quite frankly, let's be honest, we can even think about our personal interactions with anyone, whether it be unconsciously or even consciously. We have to be aware, right? And so this means that we have to be genuine. We have to make sure that we're humanizing them and their experiences, and that we hone in on those differences and make sure that they're getting the necessary tools that they need to move forward in their path, right? And so this specific philosophy, it comes from somebody who I admire, very, very amazing person, James Baldwin. So he was a novelist, a playwright, a poet, an activist, and he really made his mark on the civil rights movement during the 50s, 60s, but then even later on, right, 70s and 80s upon his death. And so one of his famous quotes is that we can disagree and still love each other unless our disagreements is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and the right to exist, right? So we always have to be intentional in our interactions and know that although, students may have different experiences than our own, that it is still our responsibility to pour into them and to give them the necessary tools that they need to navigate this world even after they leave college. And so I want to share with you a diagram to kind of remind you that of course, there are going to be physical, like visible traits that we know of that will automatically assume that, this person is this identity, right? Without really talking to them and building that relationship. And it's because of these things that we have to be very careful, because what we might do is assume something about a person's identity. And what we end up doing is offsetting them, and then they don't feel comfortable with us, right? So even though there are these visible traits that exist, we have to understand that those things that are invisible, sometimes those are the things that make their identity and make them who they are. And so we have to be able to understand that each student that we approach, we have to approach them as an individual person, and we have to understand their experience and try to get to know them and build that relationship so that we can address them, right? As advisors, right? And as volunteers, so we make sure that we provide them with the necessary things that they need to succeed. And so one of the biggest challenges with DEI work is this perspective and this perception that this work should only be confined to this particular office, right? This office should do all the things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that that's a problem, though, because I think that students begin to see these specific offices as powerless because they're like, this isn't an institutional commitment, right? This is like, whatever, it's just an offset office. Who cares? They have no power. They can't really do anything. They can't influence anything. Why should I really try to engage when I know that they're really not going to provide me with the necessary tools that I need because they're not, on that institutional level, so to speak. And so in general, I would say that, I've even heard some diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, assistant directors, directors say that the upper administration just simply are so detached from the student experience, especially the marginalized and disenfranchised students, that they have no understanding of what it is that these students need. And that's, in some ways, that's the problem that exists, right? That we want to make sure that we're breaking down some of those filters that exist there, and that we're making sure that we provide our students, even all the way up to the upper echelons of the institutions, that we're providing our students with accessibility to those folks as well. Okay. All right. So I've approached my work in a way that I feel best suits the climate, though I will have a caveat here, and I'll just pause here and just let you know that I don't necessarily think that this is the best measure, though. But this is the way in which I've been approaching this work with the current climate that I've been in at Carthage. And I've even talked to some other folks across campuses, right, across different institutions, and they feel like you have to adapt, right? And so at the stage that I'm in, this is how I've been able to adapt. And so we are tasked a lot of times with putting out fires, right? We have to jump to that next thing and save that day, right? We gotta figure these things out as we go each day. And so I specifically use this model SAVE. And the model, in some senses, this is what we're doing, right? We have this S on our chest, we come in, and we're having to figure things out as we go, not really having plans put in place so that we're minimizing some of those things before they even happen, right? And so the the S stands for support, the A stands for affirm, the V stands for validate, and the E stands for equip. And so I'm going to give you, of course, I got to give you definitions, right? I have to give you definitions. And then I'll give you some more context on how we can approach this work. So to support means to bear all and to hold up. And so students need to know that they can trust us, and that we will, of course, listen to them, right? And that we won't do it by judging them, quite frankly. We will celebrate their wins, and we will help them along their journey. So yes, of course, we know that these are young people, right? So they're still developing, right? They don't necessarily know everything and have all the necessary things that they need to make those strong decisions, but that's what we're there for. We're there to assist them and give them a frame of mind to work with. And so sometimes support can look like different things depending on the student, right? So we just have to build that relationship. That's why I keep honing in on building that relationship is key. And sometimes, quite frankly, some students just want you to ask a simple question like, how can I support you? And I found in my work that when I do ask that question, sometimes students are taken back. Like, what do you mean? How can you support me? Right? They don't necessarily know at that moment. And so I say, no, that's fine. Even if you don't necessarily know at this moment, that's totally fine. Take however many days that you need, come back and we can, have another conversation. And sometimes those students do come back and say, hey, Cess, yeah, actually, I've given this some thought, and I think that we need to do X, Y, and Z in order to make sure that this doesn't happen to other students who might, identify as X affinity group, right? Or something of a sort. Or I think that you need to put me in contact with X person because I think that person will be able to get me the necessary results that I'm looking for. And that's happened too, right? And so A stands for to offer someone emotional support or encouragement. So we have to validate their feelings and understand that they're important, right? And so we have to start off by, of course, listening and responding in simple terms. So for example, you might demonstrate this by being attentive, right? This may actually mean that you got to put these things up because some people have these things, these phones, right? And And sometimes students see that as like, oh, well, they're not listening because they have their phone out. They see that as like, oh, I don't necessarily want to talk to you because you're on your phone and you got other things going on. And I seem really unimportant to you at this moment. So students want to know that they're important, right? And so sometimes we just, quite frankly, just need to put these things up. And then sometimes it could be even, asking a question and having them to expound, because sometimes you'll find even in that they might say something and you don't quite understand their frame of mind, but you want to have a little bit more context to ground that conversation. And sometimes just asking them a simple question will help with that. But also we have to be cognizant, because when we cut them off, then we're cutting off their voice, and they feel like, okay, I can't come and talk to you because you're going to cut me off and you're going to say whatever you need to say. Right. So we want to make sure that we're intentional as well, that we're listening, we're asking those clarifying questions, but we're not cutting them off and cutting off their voice. Okay. The next one is validate. And so this means to check or to prove the validity or accuracy of something. So it also can mean recognizing or affirming the validity or the worth of a person, their feelings, or their opinions, because this person also needs to feel like they are valued and that they are worthwhile. And so you may approach a student by being open and curious, right? How are you doing today? Next, you might want to get an understanding of why is it that they're feeling like that, right? And then sometimes we need to be aware that some students are triggered because of an incident that happened maybe even early on in the semester with this particular, we could say, professor or staff or what have you, right? And then because something else happened, it triggered that emotion or that feeling in them. And then now they're like, I can't trust this person because of X, Y, and Z. And I just really don't, I'm triggered, right? But we need to be able to walk them through those steps and say, okay, well, you're triggered because that person called you blank and you feel like you've been called that by so many people. And they're calling you out your name, so you don't subscribe to that name, right? So something like that. I'm just trying to throw out an example to give you some understanding of how that can really trigger a student, for example. All right, so now we're moving down to equip. And so this is to supply with the necessary items for a particular purpose and prepare someone mentally for a particular situation or task. And so I always recommend our students to the Health and Counseling Center. And I, even sometimes I ask them, I said, do you need me to walk you to the Health and Counseling Center? Because we did have hours where we were coming in on certain days and rotating. So I would sometimes see students from time to time, and I would ask them, do you need me to make sure that you get over there? Do you need that support? Sometimes they'll say, no, I'm okay. And then sometimes they'll say, yeah, maybe I do need a little additional push to get there. No problem. Let's do it. Let's go right now. Right. And then also, we also sometimes need to even give some students some resources. There have been students who have come to me and say, hey, my family is struggling with this or that. Do you know of any services? And sometimes I don't necessarily know, and I have to be honest, I don't necessarily know everything off the flip. And so I'll say to them, okay, no problem. How about we do some research? Let's look that up together, and we'll make sure that you get that answer. And if not, I will make sure that I reach out to somebody who I know can give you that answer. And then also, sometimes it's asking them and having them think about the ways in which they can really stand up for themselves and to advocate for themselves, which I think is very, very important, right? And equipping them, making sure that they know you are now an adult, you are a decision maker. And what does that look like for you? Because sometimes that's a muscle that they have to exercise, and it doesn't feel comfortable to them. So they're just like, well, I need you to do it for me, because, and that's never a problem. I have no problem advocating, and I will usually advocate simultaneously while they're advocating for themselves as well. But we also need to make sure that the students are getting into the habit of doing these things. This is all in the process of being an adult. You have to advocate for yourself and share your voice, right? So that you make sure that you get those things addressed that you want to see addressed. And so these are some of the tools. And like I said, of course, I found them to be effective, but also I'm a strong critic of any type of environment. So not even just saying Carthage, but I'm saying any institution, right? Who does not necessarily see equity and inclusion as fitting the model of an institutional commitment, right? And so it really needs to be woven into the fabric of each institution. And the fact that we have these offices show that there was of course there was a problem there, right? And now we're trying to address that problem by having an office do some of that work. But sometimes we need a much broader commitment to doing it in order to get the work done that we really need to see actually transpire. And so, of course, like any type of quick fix, we know is not sustainable. And so we have to make sure that even across the country that we are really doing that hard work and digging at the root cause of those issues that exist, those policies, practices, and procedures, and make sure that we are having that change that needs to happen and transpire. There have also been students, and this isn't, like I said, this is not just at Carthage, but there have been students who have come up to me and say, I think this administrator X person is really performing. They don't really seem like they're being genuine. They don't seem like they're really invested in me. They seem very condescending. I just don't, I just can't, right? I just don't want to have interactions with them. And so, even in these instances, this is why it's so important that it really is an institutional commitment and that we're not just band-aiding an issue, but that we're really getting at the root cause of the issue that exists. And so now we're going to transition into talking about the different stages and some ideas on things that have happened, of course, like from the vantage point of the students, and then also some of the work that has been ongoing throughout the time that I've been at Carthage. So just to begin, when students arrived, they arrived I arrived rather 3 weeks before Jacob Blake was shot, as well as the uprising. And so students actually arrived about a week or so after everything transpired. And so students had to navigate, of course, we know the pandemic. So a lot of them remained in isolation. So that community sense that I've heard that students were actually building before the pandemic, congregating in spaces, having different activities, right? All of these things were really on the back burner. So students would literally go to whatever dining hall or whatever, bring their food to their room, and they would just stay in their room. If they had practice, whatever rotation they were on, they would go to practice, go back to their room. So it was very challenging for students because they didn't have that human interaction as much, and it was very, just very challenging. Students were also not really given a break. And so those fall breaks and spring breaks are really important for their sustainability. And I didn't realize it until they didn't necessarily have it. And they were just like, I can't go another day. Many of them were just like, I am just struggling, right? And so those breaks really are important in their experience. And then even a week before May term actually ended, there was a shooting, and I'm not sure if you all knew this, but there was a shooting about a block and a half away from campus. And so many of our students were actually at that particular bar that night, witnessed the shooting, and some even helped the victims that night. And so to say that this was a challenging year really is an understatement. A very, very difficult year for our students, staff, I'm sure faculty, navigating all these different dynamics and trying to make sure that our students get the best results that they need out of the institution. And so now I'm going to transition now to talking specifically about some of the changes that have occurred at Carthage. And so before October of 2020, different affinity groups didn't necessarily have a space on campus to call their home, to congregate. And so my supervisor actually turned his office, so this was before that though, turned his office into a space where students felt welcome. So this was before the pandemic. And then there was an idea like, hey, how about we have like an intercultural center? And sure enough, that's actually what transpired. And so the downside to that, though, is that it opened up in October of 2020, so during the pandemic. So we can only have about 7 students in that space with COVID regulations. So that was a bit of a challenge. We're going to, of course, make sure that we have other opportunities for students to utilize that space more frequently and that they really do see it as their own. One other thing is bias incident reports. And so I'll just preface by saying that bias incidents take place on every college campus. And for anybody to suggest that is not necessarily true, they are probably ill-informed because they do happen. And so over the year, there have been some messaging, of course, anti-Semitic messaging, some derogatory racial terms that have been used, some hate speech, some hate acts. And these are all, of course, reported out to our community so that they know that they have taken place. So as of I believe it was January of 2020, so this is before I got there, Carthage had unveiled a reporting system. And so students can report, whether it be anonymously or if they actually want to disclose their name and share what transpired. There's an investigation that takes place. We, of course, immediately contact that student and make sure that that student feels safe and that they feel okay, right, with what's going on. And then we follow that up. Of course, we're still doing the investigation. And then usually there's some educational component that transpires somewhat thereafter. And then the messaging goes out as well. And so these are some of the things that we've done to make sure that those students who have experienced bias incidents, that they actually have a system and a voice so that they can actually say, hey, this happened to me and I really want to see something, I want to see some sort of investigation and I want to see something happen so that I know that these incidents don't go unchecked, right? And that they're just, nobody cares about them. But we really want to make sure that we're showing our students as well as demonstrating that, no, we do care about your sense of belonging, which is really important. And so this is probably one of the last things that I will talk about here, and that is the anti-racism plan. And so this plan was released before I actually arrived to Carthage. And one thing that I have not discussed is the moonshot effort. And I'm the equity mindset coordinator for our institution. So basically, I'm in communication with some of the other folks across different campuses, and we're coordinating and rolling out that plan to our campus and making sure that everybody knows what's going on, right? And so some of the content that I've talked about above kind of fits within that anti-racism plan. But also, there will be a new course that will be released to all freshmen on the racial history of the United States. And we will have, we've had that grand opening that I talked to you all about in October of 2020. We also did a name change for the mascot. And so we are now the Firebirds. And of course, we want to continue to build community across Racine and Kenosha, and really tapping into those local organizations and community members as well, leaders, and continuing to build relationships across Kenosha and Racine. All right, and so now we are going to transition. This is probably the last transition that we will make today in this conversation, and that is to focus on self-reflection and thinking about ourselves and the work that we do. Because to be quite honest with you, the work starts and begins with each one of us. And so our students, if they don't necessarily feel comfortable in confiding in you, or they're just like, oh, this person, just can't stand this person, right? If they can't stand this person because of a personal experience that you may be having as an advisor or as a volunteer, and they just don't know if they can trust you, right? Some of these things, we want to make sure that we alleviate them as much as possible so there are no barriers between us and our students, because we want to provide the best support and help for them. And so this requires that we take a self-inventory. How are we doing? How are we doing? Are we protecting our wellness? So these are the 8 dimensions of wellness. And so I want you to take a look at this diagram and consider whether or not you are addressing each one of these circles. And if so, in what ways? And if you're not, maybe why not? Is there something that you can possibly implement? And how can you better equip yourself to take care of your wellness holistically, right? So at Carthage, we have a holistic model, making sure that we take care of the whole person. And even at Marquette, right? Curious personalis, the whole person. So I really do believe in that commitment to sustainability and taking care of ourselves. And so for next week, I would just recommend that you all do, or even this week, you might want to take time to jot down, how are you taking care of yourself? And literally, sometimes you might just need to take some pen and paper and write it down. What is it that you're doing to protect your wellness? And then you might decide, okay, well, I want to see this on a vision board. I want to be better at X thing. I don't want to eat 10 cookies a day. I really want to eat maybe 2 cookies, maybe once or twice a week. Hey, that was a big thing for me. I needed to chill on the cookies. So, so some of these things are really important for our own sustainability, because if our back and if our bodies are worn down because we're consuming all this junk, or we're consuming all these things that are not good for ourselves, if we're not drinking enough water, if we're not replenishing ourselves, it will show on the outside and our students will not come to us, okay? And so just maybe you might decide that you want to do a vision board or something to demonstrate that you know where you want to see yourself. and you know that you have room to grow, which is, there's never a bad thing. It's never a bad thing if you want to see yourself grow in a specific area. But I also will mention that you do want to give yourself some grace, because there will be some days that you're like, I don't want to do nothing related to wellness today. I want all the 10 cookies and I just want to live my life. Feel free to do that as well on those days, but just make sure that that's not a habit, right? We just want to make sure that we are building sustainability. It's a gradual process. This doesn't happen overnight. And so here's the definition, of course, and really think about that question. How are you taking care of yourself? And then I will just conclude by saying that, of course, like I said, the work starts and begins with each one of us, and that we have to support our students the best way that we can. And we have to take care of ourselves in order to make sure that we are continuously pouring into each one of them. And so the goal, of course, has always been, I think it should have been at the center of everything, is creating that environment that fosters greater equity and inclusion. And so I want to leave you with an affirmation, and I just want you to kind of let it sink in. So, of course, a part of that wellness reel is your mental wellness. And so the affirmation that I want to leave you with is, I can never afford anything that costs me my mental health. And then secondly, I want us to get radical with our wellness, right? Because each one of us is needed in this world. Each one of us is needed to support our students, our families, our communities, etc. And so I'm reminded of an Audre Lorde quote, and she said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And this is an act of political warfare. And so just wanted to, of course, extend a thank you once again for sharing this space with me. I want to especially thank Michelle and Veronica for offering to have me facilitate this conversation today. I will send out an email, a message to you all, just gauging your thoughts on how the presentation went. And now I would like to open it up for those questions that you may have. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cicely. I really, just a quick note, appreciate hearing your perspective of how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are impacting you in your role and the campus that you're at. And I think for our advisors, considering that perspective of, as advisors, you're really working with this set of undergraduate students and what they're going through in their chapter on a regular basis. But oftentimes we're not as looped in on what might be happening on campus or how our students are navigating that environment outside of the chapter. So appreciate that perspective, and definitely appreciate the dimensions of wellness and the reminder there that if we are going to be engaging in this work and these conversations with our students, that we also need to be taking care of ourselves as well, and remembering that. And I'm also a fan of cookies too, but it's probably better for us to not always be snacking. But I'll stop talking and say, if anybody does have questions right now, we'll open it up. If you should be able to unmute yourselves, or y'all can also drop a question into the chat box as well.
Hi, Cicely. My name is Kevin Guinan. I'm an advisor for the Iowa State DU chapter. And my question is, do you think these conversations are best had kind of in small group conversations regarding equity inclusion? Are they best had in small groups? Should we be talking about them at full chapter meetings? Is it best to maybe convince our men to go to maybe some presentations on campus? What are your thoughts on that?
That is a great question. Yeah, so I think having conversations on different levels is important, because I think what will end up happening is students will begin to think more strategically, right? Because even at Carthage, right, I talked to some seniors and I said, you all are now a part of a campus that is committed to anti-racism, right? And how have you thought about that? So when they go into the work environment, it's not just like this offshoot thought that I now have to put my mind in, like, what is equity? What is inclusion? How am I implementing these things, right? But it's more intentional. And so I think to have those chapter meeting conversations, it doesn't have to be long-winded. It doesn't have to be excessive. you can have maybe 10, 15-minute conversations and talks and see how just to kind of gauge the students and their perspective. Because some students, I'm telling you now, I've done some trainings where it is so quiet. Nobody has a question because they feel like they're in trouble, right? It's not that you're in trouble. We want to make sure that you're equipped with the necessary tools so that you know how to get to that next level and you can address wherever you're falling into, whether you're in healthcare, whether you're an entrepreneur, whatever, right? That you're able to really address the different needs of the people in that specific area. I would also definitely recommend if there are some things going on campus, you can even say, hey, you all, we're gonna pop into this session together and we'll do, we'll do the training together, and then we'll have a quick Q&A to see if you have any questions. Because sometimes they think that their questions are dumb questions. They're never dumb questions. If you have it, a lot of times that means that somebody else shares that same thought process, and that we want to make sure that you get those necessary things that you need in that conversation, because we don't want you walking around here ill-informed, right? So definitely having it on multiple levels, I think, is essential. Peter, I saw you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Yes, Michelle, I've unmuted myself. Several years ago, I worked for a national education organization, and I was asked to be on a task force. And it was pretty rare that staff were asked to be on these task forces. And it was a task force to look at DEI in state early childhood licensing systems and quality rating systems. So it was several days of task force meetings. I was the only male, which is not rare in my field. The task force was predominantly women of color, including Latinas, and I knew all of them, and they all had PhDs and MSWs, etc. And most of them were people of means, at least at this point in their life. Now, I say all of that to say that the first day was a large discussion of white privilege. Now, I am a very woke individual, and I certainly understand that. I understand white privilege in that, despite what challenges I've had in my life, the color of my skin is not one of them. So, I, that I know in my head, but having a whole day listening to PWM, people with money, talking about white privilege. And so I didn't say anything about that. But that night we all went out to dinner, and then everybody left, and after dinner, except for my boss and I, and we sat there drinking wine. So I'd had enough wine in me to say, I had a problem today. And she's an African-American woman, PhD. And I said, I know all of you, and you all are now people of economic privilege. You all went through graduate school. I had to stop at my master's degree because I had borrowed so much money. I still tell people I'm between degrees and I'm 71 years old. So all of that story to say, there are many, many white folks who feel like me. You feel like you're woke, but then when you keep hearing about white privilege, it's just a little too much. So how do we get to those folks and help them to be our allies in the DEI context?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and by no means am I there at all. No means. But yes, that is interesting. So what I'll say to that is, just because there are a few people who have achieved, right, some echelons, that doesn't necessarily mean that holistically, right? We know that there have been detriments of communities who have completely been mutilated, right? We know that, and we know that the generational wealth, right? We know that generational wealth has been wiped out for a lot of communities of color, right? And so I just don't want us to confuse some people achieving, like the bootstrap folks, like the Obamas and the Oprahs, right? I don't want us to confuse those folks and say, hey, well, if they're making it, what are they talking about that racism exists and white privilege and stuff like that? Because what we're not necessarily seeing is that there are still structural problems in the system across different spaces. So like I said, education, across the prison system, right? Across politics, right? It is across all realms. And so this is something that it's a deeply rooted thing. And if you're not able to recognize that it's deeply rooted, then that's the challenge there. So what I will say is that you don't want to beat a person, right? Constantly.
That doesn't work.
Constantly. Yeah, that doesn't work. But what we do need to have is some sort of understanding that these systems are in place for a reason. They've been in place. It's not that the system was ever broken. The system was built this specific way, right? And so we just want to make sure that we hit that home and then see where those conversations lead to see where folks are. Because some people just want to stop by, okay, I got the education, I know, and I'm done. Some people are like that. There are some folks who will say, no, I think I want to take this a little further. I want to use my privilege in some senses to make sure that other students, you know, who don't necessarily see that, because there's a lot of students, even when I was in school, they didn't see white privilege. They're like, what are you talking about, white privilege, right? But we know that it exists, right? So we just have to be able to triage those conversations. And I think it's just a case by case basis. Yeah. So I don't think I answered your question. But that's where I am. I think that the education is still vital and it's so important in the efforts of creating that greater, because just because a couple made it doesn't necessarily mean that as a people, folks have made it across affinity groups.
Yeah, true.
Michelle, I think we're over time. I'm sorry, you all.
Appreciate everyone for being here. If you do have additional questions, I know Cicely shared her contact information at the end. And like she said, she's going to follow up with an email as well. And this recording will be posted on the DU website under our advisor resources. This is our last advisor webinar for the 2020-2021 academic year. So we'll be taking a pause over the summer and we'll regroup in late August. As always, if there is an advisor webinar that you all would like to see, topic, presenter, etc., let me know and we will work to get that scheduled for next year. And I know we had a couple members of our Advancement of Justice Task Force with us today, and so want to recognize and appreciate their work over the past year on reviewing and understanding where the fraternity is in terms of living up to the foundation of justice, and you'll see some additional efforts and education coming from that as well in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you again, everybody. Hope that you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, or if you're watching the recording of this, whenever that day might be. Thank you all, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.